Hello, and welcome to episode 18 of TBR, the To Be Read podcast, where we talk about books, authors, in the industry. I'm joined with Jamie Maltman, my co-host. How you doing, Jamie?
I'm doing great.
And unfortunately, Michael Ronn isn't able to join us tonight. For people who kind of have listened in the past, he's expecting a baby, and his wife and he had to kind of run off to the hospital last minute tonight, so our thoughts are with him. Best of luck to both of them. Sure, everything will be fine. So let's talk about our weekend reading.
Good
How's
stuff.
yours been?
It's been really good. I've been reading a lot. I've been reading. Yeah, it was actually quite a good week for reading. I finished off the book that I had been reading, and that was Desiccate by Bonnie Ferrante, and really overall quite enjoyed it. It's like I said, it was YA, first-person female protagonist, which I normally wouldn't read so much, but I have sort of for my own writing, I actually have a character like that I'm writing from their viewpoint a lot, so I was interested in doing a little bit of almost research reading that way, and this one I did enjoy, and that's the one I was saying last week has the magic based on eye colors, and then they need to explore that. I really like that kind of thing where someone has to understand the magic in a fantasy type world, so it's not just, here's the mentor comes in and step-by-step instructions of exactly how you do everything. And here's the spell book. It's more they have to really get to know it because theirs is a little different and manifests differently. So I like that aspect. There's some cool stuff in the plot. There was some parts of it that kept me reading late into the night. That's always a good sign. Like when just one more chapter. I haven't had that phenomenon that much lately, so there's a little bit of that in the middle and some shocking kind of plot turn stuff. So overall, solid, good book, and I enjoyed it more than I even might have expected I would. So funny thing there, that one is it has a cover that I showed it to my wife, and my wife thought, oh, I'm not interested. She's like, because it's called Desiccate, which not everyone knows what the word means, but it's like, drying out fruit or that sort of thing, like, mummies are desiccated, that sort of thing. So it gives people kind of and it had a kind of a gothic-looking font, so I would think horror. I think a lot of people would think horror, and it's absolutely not horror. It's more like a wizard school for girls with some stuff, even like a Mean Girls kind of aspect in the middle there.
So is the cover a little too dark for the genre?
I think it's just not quite a fit yet. So I would love to see it's an indie author that I would love to see maybe a different choice there, and otherwise you'd really have to be strong in the blurb to. But I don't know. I might choose to do it a little bit differently. So not a bad cover and not a bad idea because it makes sense, but marketing-wise, I would switch it because I had to talk my wife into reading it, and now she is, and she's like, oh yeah, I like this. So it's a little bit different. Read another because I had two Tolkien biography type books out of the library. So I read the second little one, and these are ones that are shorter that might be in sort of the juvenile section, so like the kids nonfiction books section. But this one was a little bit slightly more advanced than that because it went into understanding Lord of the Rings, and so I was looking at some of the influences and some of the thematic aspects, and I've never actually read even like a low-level critical analysis of Tolkien stuff, so it was interesting seeing that, and I sort of skimmed through the life part because I'd read one a couple of weeks ago that way. That was by Ted Hodges. I finished off that Philosophy in Minutes book, and overall really enjoyed that. If you're someone who has always been interested in philosophy a little bit, but never enough to actually take a course or read like a thick philosophical tome or even like it was really this little book like this where it would have, I think it was like 200 pages and there'd be an image next to each one, and it's just going through all the major philosophical concepts from the beginnings of philosophy to the present and showing how really every branch of science was an offshoot of philosophy at some point.
And who wrote that?
Really, that was written by, I will grab that. I should have it right there. Yes. Marcus Weeks.
Marcus Weeks. Okay.
Yeah, it's a neat little book. I think it was 2014 published. So saw it on the library new books shelf a few weeks ago, and so that was just really cool. And then I started reading because I've heard you guys talking about it. I started reading Green Star by Canton and Higgins, and they were doing a bunch of launch week stuff this week. I saw. So I read only the first chapter I think so far. So I was like, okay, this is cool and just something completely different. And I think, well, from the sounds of it, from what you guys have said, I think I'm going to enjoy it, and I am so far. So
good.
That was my week in reading.
Okay, good. Yeah, I finally managed to finish a couple things this week as well after having.
That was good, right? Like.
Oh yeah. It's I think I've said it before. I don't know, in a blog post or something, where like I really do feel out of it, just discombobulated when I'm not reading. Like the reading just kind of focuses me, and it's something I love to do. And when I'm not doing it, I just don't feel like myself. So I finished Green Star by Simon Kenton and David Higgins. So season one, I enjoyed it a great deal. It's very campy, and I think we've talked about it a few times already. Kind of as we were reading it, it's kind of a Star Trek universe with a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy feel. I think after reading it, I think I said in my review, the thing that it struck me most is Blazing Saddles. So that slapstick, there's a real Mel Brooks feel. So I guess, Spaceballs obviously would be another, good one to relate it to. So you could picture, Rick Moranis in this world, and I don't know what character he'd play, but so it's a lot of fun. If you're looking for something, there's just kind of a nice, easy, funny read. It's great. And then I finished Survivors of the Shroud by Scott Richards. That's the third book in his Darlici's Shroud series, and I think it's a 5-book planned series at least. Thoroughly enjoyed that one. It's have you read either of the first 2 books?
I haven't yet, no.
Okay. So in the first 2 books kind of follow the same character, and there's a point of view shift in the third book, which at first kind of threw me for a bit of a loop, and it shouldn't have, because it's really good. It's a great book. It's a great series. One of the things I said in my review too was that if Scott is really a fearless writer, and I think the comment I made was that if he was writing The Walking Dead, which I don't know if you watch that show, but Daryl Dixon, everyone's favorite character, would be dead by now, because he's not afraid to, take the series where it needs to go, and I really like where it's going. So I thoroughly enjoyed that one as well. And so that's my reading for the week. Hopefully I'll be able to bang out a couple more for next week and not spend the next 2 weeks being in the middle of things.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel a little stuck when, even though I am reading, I've got like all these parallel trains and none of them are getting finished yet. And I was like that for a couple of weeks there. And now it's like, this one's finished, and this one's finished, and this one's finished, and I'm just, everything's I feel fresh and organized, and I don't know, it's just funny that way.
Yeah, I get stuck with that because rarely am I ever reading one thing. I finished 2 books this week, and on my TBR list, kind of the next on my TBR list are, 3 or 4 things at least. I'm going to be reading Graham Simson's The Rosie Effect, the sequel to The Rosie Project. Joanna Penn's new book. What was it called exactly? It's the Business for Authors that just came out. What else? I'm not even going to go into the list. I've got 3 or 4 books that I want to read next, and so I'm going to, I need to kind of whittle that down to 1 or 2 so I actually get something done. So speaking of Joanna Penn, our topic for the week is nonfiction. So, you want to start on that? What are your thoughts? Do you read a lot of nonfiction?
It's funny. I hadn't been for a while, but I went and looked back at my Goodreads over the past few years, and I've read a ton, and it's all over the place. It's funny. There was a while there when I wasn't reading much fiction. I think from when I really in university on through when I was working after university. And a lot of my book recommendations, actually it's funny, I was just thinking about the only sort of traditional source of book recommendations that I've ever really looked at all was The Economist. I used to subscribe to The Economist, and their books and art section at the back had a lot of really interesting books. And I love books in that sort of looking at economical and political history stuff and matching it all together and seeing where things came from. So that's where I used to read a lot of books in that vein. And so things like actually I read that for school, but Guns, Germs, and Steel, or there's a Civilization, How the West Beat the Rest by Niall Ferguson, or Why Nations Fail was a fantastic one I read a couple of years ago. It's neat because I like reading this stuff, and I like to write this sort of historically inspired fantasy stuff.
I was going to say that kind of fits with your writing too.
It absolutely does, and these I actually get fiction ideas reading this kind of stuff, which doesn't sound like, you know, sort of maybe the typical author process, but I absolutely love that kind of stuff. Or like, I think I have a few up here. Like I've got a Genghis Khan, looking at like, you know, Genghis Khan and his impact on Asia and the world, really.
I think a lot of authors who write that sort of historical thing do read tons of nonfiction, and I think they kind of have to.
Yeah, so I love reading some of that kind of stuff. So that's like one whole category that I haven't read as much in the last couple of years, but I love, you know, I love that stuff. Actually, one of the really more harder side of that, on the recommendation from Pressfield, Stephen Pressfield.
Warm Heart?
Yeah, Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War. I read the first volume of that because he's like, because he loves to write in that, you know, he's written in that time period, and he's like, it's one of the great sort of narrative history accounts ever, talking about that. So that was one I read, I think, earlier this year. So that's sort of one category that I could talk about. Why don't I bounce it over to you for sort of another category, and we can maybe go back and forth, because I know we've got a few different, completely different areas we've been reading.
Yeah, I mean, most of my nonfiction reading tends to be of the craft of writing, or from authors. So I'll, I've read all of the Writer's Digest books on, you know, their series on, you know, plot and characterization and all that kind of stuff. But I also really enjoy reading like Stephen King's On Writing. Fantastic book, even for non-writers. I mean, if for any fan of Stephen King, I think would get a lot out of reading that book, because he had sort of an interesting journey in his career.
And it was like, or not. It was the one, I think, did I mention that before? That it was only because I read that and really enjoyed it did I ever pick up my first Stephen King book, and then read The Stand because of how he talked about it in there, and loved it. And then I've read some of the Gunslinger books as well, and enjoyed them too. So
for nonfiction, sort of, for me, I don't read a lot of the, you know, historical stuff. I mean, I'd like to, but I mostly, I grab some things off my shelf too, so I'll mostly grab a book off from, you know, Chapters or something if they have it on sale. Like I've got this Essential Visual History of World Mythology, so I'll pick up things like that are just kind of like a quick, easy, almost like a reference, and I find stuff like that to be kind of an idea generator for me. You know, if I'm sitting there stuck on, you know, a story idea, and I'll show you this other one that I've had on this beast here, is the New York Times Guide to Essential Knowledge, and it's got everything. So it's the kind of thing that you could, if you wanted a story idea, or you know, in the days of Wikipedia, I suppose you don't need something like, but it's the kind of thing that you could flip open to a random page and there's an idea. So idea generator, so, you know, little books like that, and then, you know, books on the craft, and I'll talk a little bit more about a couple specific ones that I really love, and then I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, it's funny on the idea, like, it just made me think. I haven't been keeping track of the names of most of them, of these little ones of particular topics in history, because some of my stuff's set in like a Rome-like world. So, but I actually read a bunch of those books, but they were from the kids section, because I take my son to the library, so I've had a bunch of those kinds of things out, and he loves me reading to him some of these, like, history of the world in this sort of, you know, history of the medieval world, or you know, the history of the earth. We just did some stuff like that, so I'm constantly getting little ideas here and there, and mythology, absolutely, like I've been reading different.
But that's good too, right? I mean, because it gives you, it's a really quick and easy way to get a taste of something, and then if you like that taste, then that's when you'll kind of go to the adult section, I guess, and dive in a little deeper.
And a lot of it's memory joggers for me too, because I have read a lot on those particular things in the past, but the kids survey, you know, kids level survey course of it is, you know, works really well for that. So that's one where I've gone in more. Another area that I really enjoy reading about, and I've read a lot in the past few years, is things about the brain and learning, and where those, you know, cognitive stuff. So like Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, really, really neat book. Like, again, I get writing-y related ideas from some of this, of like how the brain works and how people might interact, but it's mostly just I find this fascinating. Or Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely, another one in that sort of vein. Or there's another one called Welcome to Your Brain, or The Playful Brain, that was talking about different types of games and what they engage and things like that. And there's a whole bunch of learning stuff, because I have young kids and learning with them. And there's a few writers like John Holt or John Taylor Gatto or different people that write stuff about learning and how kids learn and
Okay.
stuff like that. So that was a major area probably over the past 3-4 years that I've read a bunch in that side. That was really quite fascinating. Well, I'll bounce it back to you for any other areas you want.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, areas not so much, I guess, as other, so magazines we'll talk about. That's another one. So reading, that's both good for craft. And so I used to, when I started getting into the, wanting to actually finally write something, I got a subscription to Writer's Digest and kind of ran through that in a year. I didn't resubscribe because that was, I think, the articles and even the books that you read, once you've, there's only so much you can read before it all starts to sound, yeah, I know that already. And so I think while there's always something new that you can learn, it is a trap that you can fall into where it's like, well, I can't do this yet. I haven't read all of the books. So I kind of set that magazine aside, and but I do like, again, for ideas and stuff like that, I love picking up, there'll be like, I grabbed a couple off my shelf so I could think of some sort of the magazines where they'll do like a, once a year. So I've got like a National Geographic Exploring the Unexplained, which is just all kinds of, UFOs or whatever. Again, it's just like quick little things that you can pick up, to a Time magazine special on everything to do with time and time travel and how time works and all those kinds of things. So they're great. Again, just to have on your shelf as a reference, or to help you come up with ideas or think of, where to take your story and things like that. So magazines are great as well. Back to you.
Yeah, sure. Another area that I was reading a lot about for a few years there, when we were doing some business type stuff in our own life, was sort of some of it's business side stuff and some of it's sort of inspirational business type stuff. And so that's where, like, the Tim Ferriss books, like the 4-Hour Work Week, when I got into that, or Seth Godin, all his books.
I was just going to say Seth Godin, yeah, Tribes.
Yep. Or stuff like some of Guy Kawasaki's books. Like there's Enchantment was an interesting one, and then he had some stuff about Google Plus, or What the Plus was a book he had, and he actually had an author publisher entrepreneur book came out last year.
Thinking of Seth Godin, have you noticed how he's selling his new book?
Well, he loves to experiment, right? Like he had his the Domino Project for a few years, where he did a few things, and actually I read a few of his books that came out of that, or not just his books, but other people. But yeah, he's doing. I just read the blog post the other day.
It's like lateral selling, where he wants the people on his list to buy up to, I think, 99 copies of the new book, and then sell it for him, I guess. It's an interesting idea that he's asking his tribe to sort of trust him without knowing what the book is even about. Although he has kind of hinted that it's basically repurposed blog posts, or maybe things that we've seen in a different way. It's color. It looks like a really nice book, but he's looking for his tribe, I guess, to buy as many copies of the book as they feel is appropriate or can afford or feel comfortable with, and then sell it or give it away to friends. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. Yeah,
because he's really doing it to sort of manage the print run for that first, that first launch of it. So it's and he's done some similar stuff, not exactly that in the past, but he's definitely been because a lot of the nature of what he does, it's like you might buy this book and give it out to a whole bunch of people in the department you run, or that sort of thing. Like he's had a lot of that in the past.
Yep.
Or some of the ones that the Domino Project published certainly were a lot like that as well. I guess sort of related to that sort of stuff, I know you've read some of the James Altucher books and blog posts, and
yep.
So there was a bunch in that side that's kind of businessy, investing-y, inspirationally, happiness, like just kind of blending a little bit of everything together. And I know
I'm surprised that, you know what, I actually didn't have Altucher on my list.
Yes.
Shame on me.
I was waiting for you to say that. But, and then another one that's another blogger that I've read some of his books was Leo Babauta, who writes Zen Habits is his website. So it was like sort of Zen and simplicity, but he also comes from doing that, like doing business. Like he's not rejecting the material world or anything like that. It's like sort of for a while I was reading some of those productivity or efficiency or things sort of that nature.
That's Zen Habits?
Zen Habits, yeah, great blog.
Hmm.
Haven't been reading it as much lately. It's funny. I went through a couple of years there where I was reading a ton of blogs
Mm-hmm.
on a bunch of these topics. Like it could be like the Freakonomics blog on that side, or the Why Nations Fail guys have a blog that I still read and have some really interesting stuff there. Or Tim Ferriss or Leo Babauta, Seth Godin, like all those guys are in my blog, and James Altucher.
Yeah.
And so it's been interesting seeing that. But I've moved away from that, and even moved away from some of the writing books just of late. But I think part of it is I've been reading a lot more fiction and really delving into that world. You did mention the biography side. That like I don't read a ton of biographies, but I already mentioned the Tolkien ones. You already mentioned On Writing. One of my favorites ever, and this came from a Tim Ferriss recommendation, was Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, about Richard Feynman. Absolutely fantastic book. He's just one of, I think Tim Ferriss said he is the guy he would sit down to dinner with. It's like one of the most interesting people in history. And physicist who worked in the, was it the Manhattan Project? If I'm not right, or if I'm not mistaken, I think it's the Manhattan Project. But he also he's just a really interesting, curious person who likes to learn about stuff and talks in this wonderful way. And the audiobook version of that is spectacular. So check that out. I love that. I did read it's funny, before I got a Mac, a while back, I read the Steve Jobs biography as well, and that was a really interesting biography as well. Like he's just a very, very interesting man. Very polarizing, divisive, but but very interesting. Like it was a really engaging one. I think I actually listened to the audiobook on that one too, which was really a good audiobook delivery of that as well. So just a lot of different. It's funny, like a lot of the time I'll go deep and sort of delve into some of these areas for a while, and I've had periods of that. And I know when I was first looking towards writing, that was when I really went crazy and read a ton of books.
Right.
For that next while, and now it's sort of as I finish a book, I like to maybe check out another one or a shorter one or something like that. A couple of writing related ones that were a little different were I read one called Write the Fight Right. It was by a guy who's a martial artist. Joanna Penn had him on her.
Yeah, I was going to say I heard. I think I still have that one on my e-reader as like a preview, but I heard that podcast with it was a good one.
Yeah, Alan Baxter. So I read that one back then, and it definitely got me thinking slightly differently because of just some things that you might do as your first time around. And I know like it made me think of the jokes in the Self Publishing Podcast guys where they were joking about Sean's action scenes versus what Dave would like them to be, or that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Another one that I read through that time that was just a little bit different was Roz Morris. It was also interviewed around the same time by Joanna Penn. With her Nail Your Novel series, and the characters one in particular I actually really liked. I know she's someone who's like a writer, ghost writer, does various different things, does also like novel doctor kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But it was really quite a good one. I enjoyed that. And
I keep like telling myself I'm not going to continue reading books on the craft because it's like like I said, because you can never read them all, and at some point you have to stop and just do it yourself.
Absolutely.
But I keep getting sucked in, and so some of the recent ones that I've read that I really enjoyed, like How to Write a Novel Using the Snowflake Method by Randy Ingermanson. Have you read that one?
I haven't, but I've heard a bunch of people talking about it.
Yeah, it's excellent, and so that's I think I really enjoyed that one, and so that they keep being good, and so I keep reading them, and pick up little extra tips and tricks, and so like I said, you can never stop learning. I actually just picked up his Writing for Dummies, which probably maybe normally wouldn't have gone because I've read a ton of books on reading. Why do I need to read one called Writing on Dummies? But it's one that it was recommended. I think Simon Canton recommended that one. Another good one that I read recently was the 2K to 10K.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I've read that too.
By Rachel Aaron. That's another good one, and that's more about time management and how to get more written in the day. Steal Like an Artist by Austin Kleon. That was a great little book. What else? One of the books I grabbed off my shelf is I'm going to show it to you and see if if I show it to you quickly. See, this is the one book every author absolutely has to have on their shelf. no arguments, and I'm sure you'll know what this is if I just kind of run it past the screen real quick.
I was guessing.
Were you going to guess? So that's,
Yeah.
for people who are just listening, of course, that's Strunk and White's The Elements of Style, which, I mean, it's teeny tiny, probably cheap and amazing.
I was just showing off this one. I can't remember if I showed it before.
I think you've shown that before. Yeah.
Yeah, just because it is just one of the coolest books I've ever seen because of the combination of like illustrations, and it's like they're like just really cool science fiction and fantasy infographic-y stuff throughout. Mm-hmm. And it's not just that, but it's and this is Jeff Vandermeer is the one who wrote it, but then it's got contributions to little essays or little appendices written by George R. R. Martin or Lev Grossman, Neil Gaiman, Ursula K. Le Guin, Joe Abercrombie, David Anthony Durham. So it's like a bunch of really neat people, and just it was so many cool perspectives, and it's such a beautiful book, and it's the illustrated guide to creating imaginative fiction. So it really is a writing book for science fiction, horror, fantasy writers on that perspective, and it's just I don't know, it's just so beautiful. It's like my favorite physical book that I bought in a long time, or had bought for me. I told my mother to.
And it'll be years before we go digital with stuff like that, right?
Well, I just wouldn't like this like that. It's so rare. Like I don't buy that. I mostly buy ebooks now, but that was one book that I was like, wow. It's so, and I it's funny because you're saying like as you're writing, it's one that I wanted to savor. Like I would read a little bit, and then I'm like, okay, I'm not going to read much more for a while. And I tried. That's just funny because I was doing a lot of that, reading lots of stuff early on, and I think it was Christine Rush just talking about, or Dean Wesley Smith, or both of them in different ways.
It's her husband and wife, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Reading too much about the craft while you're writing can mess you up. But reading about it just before you go into, reading about it just before you go into an editing phase is a different time. That's not too bad. Or reading like just after you finished one book before the next one. That's sort of where you have time to reflect and have time to work on it. Your craft a little bit better. But it can definitely get in the way of writing the end of whatever you're working on. So.
I just slipped away there for 2 seconds because I wanted to grab a book off the shelf. I don't know if you've read this one, but this is a book I read late last year, early this year, I can't remember, but it's one of the more recent sort of books on the craft that really just kind of blew my mind, and that is Wired for Story by Lisa Cron. Mm-hmm. Highly, highly recommend this book, and it's the subtitle, I guess, is The Writer's Guide to Using Brain Science to Hook Readers from the Very First Sentence. And just absolutely loved that one, and that's one I had bought on the Kobo or Kindle, one or the other. And then as soon as I finished reading it, I went online and bought a physical copy so I could, highlight it and mark it up on my next read. Let's see, and we're coming up on half an hour here if we haven't already passed it. So I guess all of the learning, all of the reading about the craft, one of the in thinking about and about talking about this stuff tonight, I have to say that it's the one book we haven't mentioned yet, and all of the things that I've read about the craft really do, in my mind, lead to this one thing, this one idea, and this one book. And I don't know if you know what I'm talking about already, but
it could be one way. But yeah, I'll let you go with it.
Write, publish, repeat. So I mean, we talk about the self-publishing podcast a lot, and this was a book by Johnny B. Truant and Sean Platt, and came out late last year, right? Last November, I think. And no matter what else we're reading about the craft, and it really just does boil down to that simple: get it written, get it out there, and do it again.
Yeah, and it's funny because it's a book that, well, again, I've listened to the podcast for a long time, so when it finally came time to read the book, it was just sort of reinforcing what I'd already heard and learned through watching them and experiencing it as they talked about it and as they masterminded about it. It's been interesting where we talked to, we've talking to some other writers who had already been writing for a while, and their reaction to it is more, well, yeah. So it's a perfect thing for as you're working towards either looking to write your first book or writing your first couple of books kind of thing, and then just more making sure you focus on continuing to write instead of chasing after the latest, marketing related thing, that sort of thing. So it sort of becomes self-evident, but it takes you finishing that first book and then maybe finishing that second book, and then you really get into you get more of the response of, well, yeah, from the authors, from some other authors we've heard from. So yeah, absolutely, like, cool stuff.
So is there any sort of final ones that you wanted to make sure you don't miss?
Just trying to think. I think I covered all of my areas there that I've been looking at. I think that covers all those ones. Oh, okay. You know what? Another just totally different approach from the writing side was, I don't know if you've read this one, but Zen in the Art of Writing, which is this collection of essays by Ray Bradbury.
Honestly, I'm aware of the book. I can't remember if I've read it. I'm gonna have to say I don't think I have, but it's on my list. Yeah.
That was a neat little one. That was just a very different approach, and he just gave me a real appreciation. It's a combination, slightly biographical, but then different points in his life and different aspects of the different things and his writing process and what have you.
I love seeing his. There's a couple great interviews or speeches of his on YouTube that you can watch, where he really talks about, again, that sort of write, publish, repeat. I think his big thing is, if you want to get going, he said, write one short story a week for a year, because nobody can write 52 short stories, and there's got to be something good in there somewhere, right?
No, absolutely.
I like hearing him speak.
Yeah, practice by writing, not by reading about writing. Right?
There you go. That's the trick, right? Or one of them. Okay, so a couple things we'll go into just before we kind of close out. So first of all, thanks to everyone who's been listening to the podcast. You guys have been great. We are 100% caught up on iTunes finally after switching hosts a while ago. We had to move everything to a new feed. So just this week we've got everything uploaded onto iTunes on the new feed, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to, as we continue doing these every Tuesday, get the sort of most recent episode uploaded the night of, if not the next day. If anyone's inclined, it would be amazing if you could go into iTunes there and rate and review the show, or there or anywhere else where you get the feed. Next week's topic is going to be reading about authors. So do we look into and learn about authors before we read their work, or while we're reading it, or after, or never? And you can find us at tbrpodcast.com. And as always, we'll be recording live on Tuesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern for the foreseeable future, for those of you who want to join us live. If not, we really do appreciate you listening afterwards on either on YouTube or iTunes. And that's it for me. Any closing thoughts, Jamie?
Just, we hope everything's great with Michael and his wife and his soon-to-be growing family, and we'll see him again on the podcast when everything there permits. So.
Absolutely. Okay, well, you have a great night.
You too.
Take care.
Happy reading.